A great city is supposed to be defined by what it builds. Manchester gave the world football clubs, music that changed pop culture forever, and an industrial revolution that shaped the modern age. The streets of this city should be remembered for the bands that played in its venues, the goals scored in its stadiums, and the families who built their lives on its terraces. But for the men in this list, Manchester became something else entirely. It became a city of doormen with handguns under their jackets. A city of 14-year-old boys shot in takeaway shops. A city where the most powerful gangsters mediated truces the police could not. A city the newspapers gave a nickname its own residents grew to hate. These were not random criminals. These were the men who turned a great British city into a battleground for 50 years. Today we are covering Manchester's most notorious gangsters and the full list of drug lords who ruled it. Section 1. Anthony White. Tony Johnson and the Cheetham Hill Gang's reign of terror. In the early hours of the 22nd of February 1991, a young man called Anthony Johnson got into his white Ford Cosworth and drove through the streets of Cheetham Hill in North Manchester. He was 22 years old. Most people his age were finishing university or starting their first proper job. Anthony Johnson was already one of the most feared men in the city. By the time the sun came up on that cold Friday morning, he would be lying in a pub car park with bullets in his back, and the entire shape of Manchester's underworld would be about to change forever. Anthony James Johnson was born on the 22nd of July 1968. His life never had a soft start. His mother Susan was only 15 when she had him. Neither his mother nor his biological father stuck around to raise him. So for most of his childhood, Anthony lived in a small, semi-detached house in Fallowfield in South Manchester with his step-grandmother, Winnie Johnson. The Johnson family was already carrying a heartbreak that would never go away. Winnie was the mother of Keith Bennett, one of the children taken by Ian Brady and Myra Hindley in the Moors murders of the 1960s. Keith vanished in June 1964 at the age of 12, and his remains have never been found to this day. Anthony grew up inside the shadow of that loss. He left school in 1984 at the age of 16. He was not a tall man, but he was muscular and knew how to fight. He started running with the Cheetham Hill Gang, who locals called the Hillbillies. The gang operated out of the Waterloo estate and the streets around Cheetham Hill in the north of the city. They did armed robberies. They sold drugs in clubs. They used violence the way other people used a phone. Anthony Johnson was given the nickname White Tony for one simple reason. The Cheetham Hill Gang was made up mostly of black members, and Anthony stood out as one of the few white faces in the crew. The name stuck for the rest of his short life. He started at the bottom. He did robberies. He worked his way up by being more willing to use a firearm than the men around him. By his late teens, he had become the driver and bodyguard for the leader of the Hillbillies, ferrying him around the city in a Ford Sierra Cosworth. Then, on Saturday the 9th of January 1988, when Tony was just 19, he stepped fully into the world he had been chasing. A rival from a Moss Side gang called Anthony Scratch Gardner pulled up outside an unlicensed drinking spot. Tony stepped out from the shadows, pulled a sawn-off shotgun from inside his coat, and ended Gardner's life right there on the pavement. Gardner was 26. He was the first man Tony was suspected of killing. He would not be the last. What made the Cheetham Hill Gang so dangerous was that they were ahead of their time. While most British gangs in the late 1980s were still fighting with knives and fists, the Hillbillies were already moving in body armour. In 1990, police spotted Tony Johnson wearing a Kevlar bulletproof vest and carrying semi-automatic firearms. Greater Manchester police were genuinely shocked. They had no idea the local gangs were that well equipped. It changed everything. The arms race in Manchester had begun, and Tony Johnson was the man holding the starting pistol. Then in February 1990, an opportunity opened up. A rival outfit from South Manchester called the Pepper Hill Mob lost 1.5 kilos of heroin when a courier in London was arrested. The seizure caused a heroin shortage across Manchester and left the Pepper Hill weak. Tony moved straight into the gap. The Cheetham Hill Gang took over the supply. The result was the start of a war between North and South Manchester that would define the city for the next 20 years and earn it a nickname the locals would come to hate. To rub it in, Tony and a small group of hillbillies drove down to a festival in Moss Side in front of hundreds of people and tipped over the car belonging to the Pepper Hill leader, a man called Delroy Brown. It was a public message. "We are here. We are taking over. Come and stop us." The money kept coming. In November 1990, Tony was involved in an armed robbery on a security van at Mumps Bridge in Oldham. The crew got away with £362,000 in cash. But the proceeds did not get split the way some people thought they should. A dispute kicked off over the money. Among the men who felt cheated were the Nunan brothers, an Irish Mancunian crime family who controlled most of the city's nightclub doors and were already among the most powerful operators in the region. Tony made his second mistake at a New Year party going into 1991. The Nunans had a younger brother called Damien, who was head doorman at the Haçienda, the most famous nightclub in Europe at that time. Tony, drunk and armed, threatened the doorman working that door. He was waving a gun around. He had already fallen out with the family over the robbery money. Now he was disrespecting them in front of a crowd. The clock had started. On the 22nd of February 1991, Tony was driving through Cheetham Hill with his close friend Tony McKee, a man known on the streets as Black Tony. They pulled up near the Penny Black pub on Winterford Road. The pub was partly owned by Derek Nunan. They were flagged down by two men in another car. As Tony Johnson tried to reverse out, his exit was blocked by a taxi. Inside the taxi was a man called Paul Flannery, who used a wheelchair. Flannery opened fire and hit Black Tony McKee. McKee ran for a nearby house. Then, according to the case later put before the courts, Desmond Nunan, Derek Nunan, Damien Nunan, and another man called Michael Sharples joined in. Tony Johnson was hit. He tried to run. He tried to climb a wall to escape. He was shot in the back. He fell. 2 more shots ended it. He was 22 years old. The funeral brought more than 200 mourners to Southern Cemetery in Chorlton. A motorcade of 30 cars rolled in. The chapel could not hold the crowd. Desmond Nunan was tried twice for the murder of Anthony Johnson. The first trial in 1992 collapsed. The second trial in 1993 ended in acquittals for everyone charged. Greater Manchester Police never reopened the case. 24 years later, in 2005, Desmond Nunan would be stabbed in the street and die from his injuries. Tony Johnson's death did not end the war. It started a new one. With the most feared man in North Manchester gone, the Nunan family stepped fully into the space he left behind, and the hillbillies turned on each other in a power struggle that would spill blood across the city for the rest of the decade. But while the death of White Tony reshaped the north of the city, 3 brothers from a tiny terraced house with 14 children inside were quietly taking control of every door, every club, and every corner of the Manchester nightlife. Their surname would become more feared than any gang acronym, and the bigger they got, the more bodies started to pile up around them. Section 2. The Nunan crime family. 3 brothers who ran Manchester for 20 years. After Anthony Johnson was shot in 1991, the door to the top of Manchester's underworld was wide open. The Nunan brothers walked straight through it. They would not let go of that door for the next 20 years. The Nunans grew up in Whalley Range, a working-class part of South Manchester, in an Irish family of 14 children. Every single one of those 14 siblings had a first name beginning with the letter D. It was their father's tribute to Dublin, the Irish capital where he had been born. Money was tight. The house was packed. The brothers learned early that if you wanted respect on the streets of Manchester, you had to take it. There were 3 Nunan brothers who would become known across the country. Desmond, the oldest and the most feared, was born on the 8th of August 1959. He went by Desi. He was tall, broad, and built like a heavyweight boxer. One Manchester journalist later described him as the underworld equivalent of RoboCop. The middle brother was Damien. He was charming, good-looking, and a natural fighter. He would become the face of the family on the doors of the most famous nightclubs in Europe. The youngest of the 3 was Dominic, born on the 13th of June 1964. Dominic was the planner. He was the man who handled the business side. Years later, he would legally change his surname to Latley Fotfoy. The new surname was an acronym. It stood for Look After Those That Look After You, and a much stronger version of the same warning aimed at anyone who crossed them. Desi started his criminal career as a doorman in the early 1980s. He had the size, the reputation, and the willingness to use violence. Once he had a foot in the door, he started replacing the existing security with his own men. The takeover was fast and quiet. By the late 1980s, around 80% of all the nightclub doors in Manchester were controlled by the Nunan family. Whoever runs the doors of a city runs the drug trade inside it. Dealers paid the doorman for permission to sell. Doorman reported to the Nunans. The Nunans took a cut of everything. Damien Nunan became the head doorman at the Haçienda, the legendary Manchester nightclub run by Factory Records and the band New Order. The Haçienda was the centre of British dance music in the late 1980s and early 1990s. It was packed every weekend. According to multiple gangland accounts, the family was earning up to £50,000 a night from the drug trade tied to that one club alone. While Damien was on the doors, Dominic was in prison. Around the same time the family was taking over the city, Dominic had been jailed for 15 years for his part in an armed bank robbery in Cheetham Hill. He ran the family from inside his cell. Letters, visits, and word of mouth carried his orders to the streets. Then came 1991, and the death of Anthony Johnson in the car park of the Penny Black pub. Desi Nunan was charged with the murder. The first trial collapsed. The second ended in acquittal. By the end of those court cases, every serious figure in Manchester knew that the Nunans were the new power. The Cheetham Hill gang lost their figurehead. The Nunans gained an entire territory. Through the 1990s, their empire grew far beyond the city. They expanded into Liverpool, Newcastle, and London. Desi made connections with criminal figures in the West Midlands and helped move firearms and narcotics between the regions. Police later believed that the Nunans were linked to at least 25 gangland murders during their reign. None of those cases ever produced a conviction against the family. Witnesses changed their statements, juries got nervous, trials collapsed. The family had a saying about how the system worked, and the system seemed to keep proving them right. By the end of the 1990s, the family had reportedly made over £8 million from armed robberies and security alone. Dominic was released from prison in 2002 and stepped straight back into the operation. Desi was already running it day to day. Damien was still on the doors and in the spotlight. They looked untouchable. Then everything came apart in 18 months. In 2003, Damien Nunan was on holiday in the Dominican Republic. He was riding a motorbike when he had an accident. He did not survive. The middle brother, the most popular of the three, was gone in an instant. The family buried him in Manchester and tried to carry on. 2 years later, on the night of the 18th of March 2005, Desi Nunan was drinking in a pub in Northern Moor, Wythenshawe. By then, police suspected that he had developed a serious drug habit of his own. He left the pub and went looking for a dealer. He ended up in Chorlton, in a confrontation with a South Manchester drug dealer called Derek McDuffus. McDuffus stabbed him. Desi managed to phone his wife, Sandra. He told her he had been stabbed and asked her to come and pick him up. By the time she found him, he was lying unconscious on Merseybank Avenue. He died before the ambulance reached the hospital. He was 45 years old. McDuffus was later convicted and given a life sentence. Dominic Nunan was now the last brother standing. The family business had lost 2 of its 3 pillars in less than 2 years. He kept going for another decade, but the courts were finally catching up to him. In early 2016, he was sentenced to 11 years for arson, blackmail, and perverting the course of justice. In May 2018, he received a further 11-year sentence for 13 historic offences. He remains in prison today, the last public face of a family that once ran the city. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Nunans built their empire on the doors of nightclubs, but while they were taking over the security of Manchester, another man across the river in Salford was building his own empire from the same playbook. He would become the city's new Mr. Big, and his death in his own driveway would set off the bloodiest gang war Manchester had seen in decades. Section 3. Paul Mr. Big Massey, the Salford gangster executed in his own driveway. Paul Massey was just 12 years old the first time the police took him away. The charge was criminal damage. The year was 1972. He was sent to an approved school, which was the British system for dealing with troubled children. Most kids who went through that system either straightened out or got worse. Paul Massey got worse. By the time he came back to Salford, he was already on the path that would turn him into the most famous gangster the city had ever produced. He was born on the 7th of January 1960 in Ordsall, one of the toughest parts of Salford. Ordsall was a working-class dock area, sitting right across the River Irwell from Manchester United football ground. Paul was one of 6 children of Rose and John Massey. The family had no money, the docks were closing. By 1982, the Salford docks where 5,000 men had once worked shut down completely. Unemployment among young men in the area ran close to 90%. There were no factories left, there were no jobs left. But there were nightclubs, and there were drugs, and there was a city next door full of people willing to spend money on both. Paul Massey was short. He stood only 5 foot 8 inches tall, but he was built like a fire hydrant, with a broad nose and brown eyes that locals said never blinked. He started out as a football hooligan, fighting alongside the Manchester United supporters known as the Red Army. From the terraces, he moved into running his own crew. The crew became one of the biggest forces in 1980s Salford gangland. By the early 1990s, Paul was setting up his own security companies. Through those companies, he worked alongside Damien Nunan to take over the doors of nightclubs across Manchester. If you wanted to run a club in Salford or Manchester, you paid Paul Massey to look after the door. If you sold drugs inside that club, you also paid Paul Massey. In 1992, the city of Salford was rocked by riots and civil unrest. A council meeting was called to discuss what was happening. During that meeting, a Salford city councillor called Joe Burrows pointed the finger at Paul Massey. Burrows said Massey was the man pulling the strings behind the violence. He called him Mr. Big. The nickname stuck for the rest of Paul's life. He hated it. His family said he hated it, but every newspaper in the country called him by that name from then on. In 1998, outside a nightclub in Manchester, Paul Massey was involved in a violent confrontation with another man. He stabbed his victim in the leg. The wound severed an artery. The victim survived, but only just. Paul fled to Amsterdam. The British authorities tracked him down and brought him back. In April 1999, he was sentenced to 14 years in prison at Manchester Crown Court. The sentence was later reduced to 10 years on appeal. He served his time at HMP Frankland in Durham. He was released in 2007. When he came back to Salford, the city had changed. A new generation of criminals had grown up while he was inside. The most powerful new figure was a man called Stephen Britton, who was running a Salford gang known as the A-Team. Paul Massey became a mentor to Britton and the A-Team. He also became something else. He became a peacemaker. Throughout his career, Paul had refused to deal in heroin. His men used to put up stickers around Salford warning local dealers that selling heroin would get them physically punished. He kept that code his whole life. When the gangs of Manchester started killing each other in the 1990s, it was often Paul Massey, not the police, who brokered the truces. He was respected across the underworld in a way few other men ever were. In 2012, Paul Massey did something that shocked everyone. He ran for mayor of Salford. He stood as an independent candidate. He campaigned on a platform of helping young people and rebuilding the community. Halfway through the campaign, he was arrested for money laundering allegations. He blamed the police. When the votes were counted, he finished 7th out of 10 candidates. He had received nearly 2,000 votes from the people of Salford. By 2015, things in Salford were getting dangerous again. The A-Team had split into 2 factions. A breakaway crew known as the anti-A-Team had emerged. The 2 sides were at war. Paul Massey was trying to keep the peace. He was 55 years old, had 5 children and 8 grandchildren, and was no longer a young man. On the evening of the 26th of July 2015, Paul stopped at a bargain booze shop on the outskirts of Manchester at 23 minutes past 7 in the evening. He bought a bottle of Bacardi and 2 litres of Coke. He tipped the cashier with the change. As he left the shop, a man followed him out, 17 seconds behind. That man was a hitman named Mark Fellows. Paul drove home to his house on Manchester Road in Clifton, Salford. As he stepped out of his silver BMW, Fellows opened fire with a submachine gun. Paul Massey was hit and dropped near his bins by the side of the house. He died at the scene. He was the most powerful man in Salford one moment, and a body in his own driveway the next. His funeral drew thousands of mourners. His coffin arrived in a horse-drawn carriage. The streets were lined with Manchester United flags. Greater Manchester Police offered a £50,000 reward for information about the killing. From January to December 2015, there were 19 separate shootings in Salford as the city tore itself apart in retaliation. Police believe one of those shootings, which left a 29-year-old woman and her 7-year-old son injured, was directly linked to the war over Paul Massey's death. The man who pulled the trigger that night was a quiet, pale, ordinary-looking cyclist from Salford. He had no famous nickname yet. He had no major convictions. He was about to become one of the most feared contract killers in modern British history, and the second man he murdered would be even more high-profile than Paul Massey. Section 4. Mark the Iceman Fellows, the cyclist hitman caught by his own watch. To his neighbours, Mark Fellows looked like the most ordinary man in Salford. He was 40 years old, slim, pale, and quiet. He worked as a night shift sous chef. He was a devoted family man. He cycled every weekend. He ran in local races. He wore a Garmin sports watch and tracked his routes the way thousands of British fitness fans do. People who passed him on the street would not have looked twice. But Mark Fellows was leading a double life that no one around him suspected. By day, he was chopping vegetables in a Salford kitchen. By night, he was one of the most ruthless contract killers in modern British history. The world knew him by a different name. They called him the Iceman. He was born on the 5th of September 1980. He grew up in Salford during the years when Paul Massey was the most powerful man in the city. Fellows came up through the local crime scene quietly, working for a Salford gang that had broken away from the main A-Team faction. By the early 2000s, that breakaway crew had become known on the streets as the anti-A-Team. They were at war with Paul Massey and his protégé Stephen Britton. Massey was the king of Salford. The anti-A-Team wanted him gone. They needed a man who could pull the trigger and disappear into a normal life the next morning. They found Mark Fellows. The job was simple. Watch Massey for weeks, learn his routine, find a moment when he was alone, predictable, and far from his protection. Then end it. For months in the spring of 2015, Fellows did exactly that. He watched Paul Massey come and go from his home on Manchester Road in Clifton, Salford. He drove past the house multiple times a day. CCTV footage and number plate cameras would later show his car circling the property. On the 29th of April 2015, Fellows did something that would eventually destroy him. He went out to a field directly opposite Massey's house to scout the perfect firing position. He cycled some of the way. He walked the rest. He stayed in that field for around 8 minutes, looking at angles and exit routes, and the entire time he was wearing his Garmin Forerunner watch on his wrist. The watch was tracking everything. It logged his speed, his location, and the time he spent at each point on the route. Fellows had no idea that this small piece of fitness gear was about to become the key piece of evidence in his own future trial. On the evening of the 26th of July 2015, Mark Fellows put on military-style fatigues, picked up a submachine gun, and waited. When Paul Massey returned from the local off-licence with his bottle of Bacardi and Coke, Fellows opened fire. Massey died in his own driveway. Fellows escaped along the route he had scouted 3 months earlier. He went home, washed up, and returned to his life as a night shift cook. He was reportedly paid around £10,000 for the killing. For 3 years, the police suspected him. They knew he was an anti-A-Team man. They knew he had no proper alibi, but they could not connect him to the crime scene. There were no witnesses willing to talk. There was no DNA. The case went cold. Fellows kept cycling. He kept running races. In May 2015, he had even taken part in the Great Manchester 10K event, photographed clearly with the Garmin watch on his wrist. the same watch that held the data that would one day put him away for life. Then on the 5th of May 2018, Fellows took on a second job. The target this time was Paul Massey's closest friend, a Liverpool gangster called John Kinsella. Kinsella was 53 years old, a former mixed martial arts fighter who acted as muscle for the A-team. He was walking near the M62 motorway with his pregnant girlfriend and their dogs. Fellows, dressed in a high-visibility cycling vest, rode up on a bike, opened fire, and ended Kinsella's life right there on the path. He cycled away in seconds. This time, the witnesses got a clear look. CCTV captured the high-vis vest and the bike with its distinctive yellow markings and black tape. Within weeks, detectives had identified Fellows. They raided his Salford home on the 30th of May 2018, just 3 days after he had returned from a brief trip abroad. Inside the house, they found the Garmin watch. When forensic experts analysed the data on the device, the entire 2015 case against Fellows reopened. The watch placed him in a field directly opposite Paul Massey's home on the 29th of April 2015. A GPS expert called Professor Last gave evidence at the trial. He explained that the wearer of the watch had been moving at 12 miles per hour, which suggested a bicycle, then dropped to 3 miles per hour, which suggested walking, then stopped for around 8 minutes. It was a textbook reconnaissance trip. Fellows stood trial at Liverpool Crown Court. The trial lasted 7 weeks. The jury deliberated for 31 hours and 3 minutes. On the 16th of January 2019, they returned guilty verdicts on both murders. His co-accused, a man called Stephen Doyle, was found guilty of the Kinsella murder but cleared of involvement in the Massey killing. Fellows smiled and nodded as the verdicts were read. He showed no emotion. Mr. Justice William Davis sentenced Mark Fellows to a whole life term. That meant he would never be released. He became one of only around 70 prisoners in the entire United Kingdom serving such a sentence. In February 2019, just weeks after sentencing, he was attacked at HMP Whitemoor by another prisoner using a weapon made from razor blades. He was airlifted to hospital with severe injuries. He survived. In November 2025, he was charged with murder again, this time over the death of another inmate at HMP Wakefield. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Fellows was being caught by his own fitness watch, another man from Manchester was making national headlines for an entirely different kind of nightmare. He had only one eye, an obsession with weapons, and a feud with a rival family that would end in the worst attack on British police officers in living memory. Section 5. Dale One-Eye Cregan, the drug dealer who murdered 2 police officers. Dale Cregan was a young man with one eye, 10 guns, and a reputation across East Manchester that scared even other criminals. By the autumn of 2012, he was the most wanted fugitive in the country. By the time he walked into a police station and gave himself up, he had carried out the worst attack on British police officers in living memory. He was born Dale Christopher Cregan on the 6th of June 1983 at Tameside General Hospital. His father Paul was a tool setter who eventually left the family. His mother raised him, his older brother Dean, and his younger sister on her own. The family lived in Droylsden, a working-class area in the east of Greater Manchester. Dale went to Little Moss High School, which has since closed down. He started dealing cannabis while he was still in school. People who knew him at the time said he developed an unusual fascination with knives. When he was a teenager, he spent around 18 months living with his sister on the Spanish island of Tenerife. He came back to Manchester with bigger ambitions. By the age of 22, he was no longer a small-time street dealer. He was selling cocaine across East Manchester and claimed to be earning £20,000 a week in profit. He started collecting firearms. By the time the police caught up with him, he had built up an arsenal of around 10 weapons, including machine guns. On paper, he listed his occupation as a plasterer. Somewhere along the way, Dale Cregan lost his left eye. He told friends he had been in a brawl in Thailand. Some people who knew him claimed it had been removed with a knife in circumstances that were never made public. He wore a glass eye in the empty socket. The streets of Droylsden gave him a nickname that stuck for the rest of his life. They called him One Eye. The chain of events that led to the worst day in modern British policing started in a pub in May 2012. Two local crime families had been at odds for years. They were called the Shorts and the Atkinsons. Dale Cregan was a close friend of Leon Atkinson, the head of the Atkinson family. On the 13th of May 2012, members of both families had a confrontation at the Cotton Tree pub in Droylsden. The argument was bitter. The Atkinsons wanted revenge. 12 days later, on the 25th of May 2012, Dale Cregan walked into the Cotton Tree pub wearing a balaclava. He was carrying a handgun. Inside the pub, he opened fire. He killed Mark Short, a 23-year-old member of the Short family. 3 other men inside the pub were injured. Cregan's intended primary target was Mark's father, David Short, but David happened to be in the bathroom at the moment of the attack. Cregan escaped. The police arrested him in June 2012 in connection with the killing, but had to release him on bail because of insufficient evidence at that stage. He used his time on bail to finish what he had started. On the 10th of August 2012, Cregan went to David Short's home on Folkestone Road East in Clayton, East Manchester. He shot David Short and threw a military-style hand grenade. David Short, 46 years old, was killed at the scene. Cregan went on the run. For more than a month, Greater Manchester Police hunted him across the country. The Short family blamed the police for not protecting them. Cregan, hiding from arrest, blamed the police for what he claimed was the harassment of his family. On the morning of the 18th of September 2012, Dale Cregan made a hoax 999 emergency call. He claimed someone had thrown a concrete brick at a property in Hattersley, Tameside. 2 officers were dispatched to investigate the report. Their names were Nicola Hughes and Fiona Bone. Nicola Hughes was 23 years old. She was born on the 16th of October 1988 and raised in Oldham. She had joined Greater Manchester Police in 2009. Friends described her as bubbly and compassionate. Away from work, she was a karate champion. Fiona Bone was 32. She was born on the 31st of December 1979 in Norwich and raised in Scotland. She had also joined Greater Manchester Police in 2009. On the morning she was killed, she had been working on her wedding invitations. The 2 officers arrived at Abbey Gardens in Hattersley at around 11 in the morning. Dale Cregan was waiting for them. He opened fire with a Glock pistol and threw a military hand grenade. Both officers died. The attack lasted 31 seconds. Cregan then drove to a police station in Hyde, walked in and turned himself in. He told officers he had done 2 of them because they had been hounding his family. The case was so severe and the threat so high that the trial was held under enormous security at Preston Crown Court. It lasted 17 weeks. Throughout the proceedings, Cregan had to remove his glass eye every time he entered or left the courtroom so that prison officers could check the empty socket for hidden objects. On the 13th of June 2013, Mr. Justice Holroyd sentenced Dale Cregan to life imprisonment with a whole life order. He will never be released. He was convicted of 4 murders, the 2 police officers and the 2 members of the Short family, plus 3 attempted murders connected to the Cotton Tree pub shooting. His friend Leon Atkinson was found not guilty on all charges. Dale Cregan was the latest in a long line of Manchester drug dealers to bring violence to the streets. But the gun problem in the city had not started with him. It went back decades, to a war between 2 estates in South Manchester, so bloody that the press gave the entire city a nickname that the residents would spend the next 20 years trying to escape. Section 6. The Gooch Close Gang versus the Doddington, the Gunchester era. For most of the 1990s, the city of Manchester carried a nickname that nobody who lived there ever wanted. The newspapers called it Gunchester. The name came from a single inner-city war between 2 rival gangs in South Manchester in a small estate called Alexandra Park. The fighting on that estate would go on for almost 20 years. By the time it ended, dozens of people would be dead, hundreds would be wounded, and a generation of young men would be locked up for life. The story of Gunchester begins in Moss Side, a working-class area of South Manchester with a long history of poverty. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, jobs were scarce. Unemployment among young black and ethnic minority residents was reportedly running at around 40%. The The drug trade became one of the few ways for young men to make money. Two gangs took control. On the west side of the Alexandra Park estate, around a small dead-end street called Gooch Close, the Gooch Close gang was born. They were also known as the Gooch. On the east side of the same estate, around a pub called the Pepper Hill, a rival outfit called the Pepper Hill Mob set up shop. The two gangs lived a few hundred yards apart. They saw each other every day, and they were about to start killing each other. The trigger for the war was control of the local drug market. By the late 1980s, the Pepper Hill Mob were earning serious money on their side of the estate. Reports at the time suggested they were making around £11 million a year. A bigger and more established crew across town, the Cheetham Hill Gang, started demanding a tax from the Moss Side dealers. The Pepper Hill fought back. The Gooch sided with the Cheetham Hill, partly because a senior Gooch member was a cousin of the Cheetham Hill leader. The Pepper Hill saw it as a betrayal. From that moment, the lines were drawn. The Alexandra Park estate was split in half. Anyone living on the wrong street was suddenly on the wrong side. In August 1991, Greater Manchester Police launched their first major response. It was called Operation China. 23 leading gang members were arrested in a coordinated swoop. By 1992, all of them had been jailed on drug and weapons charges. The arrests caused chaos inside the Pepper Hill, who regrouped around a different street called Doddington Close on the east side of the estate. They renamed themselves the Doddington Original Gangsters. They were the same crew, they just had a new name and a new headquarters. The arrests slowed the war for a moment. By late 1992, some of the older Gooch and Doddington members were even meeting in person and talking about a truce. They played football matches together. There was talk that the war was finally going to end. It did not. In January 1993, 14-year-old Benji Stanley was waiting in a takeaway shop in Moss Side called Alvino's Patty and Dumplin' on Weston Street. He was standing in line with a friend. He had no gang record. He was just a teenager. A gunman walked up to the shop window and opened fire with a shotgun. Benji was killed at the scene. The bullet was meant for someone else. Police later identified the likely intended target as a member of the Doddington gang who looked similar to Benji. The killer was never caught. Benji's mother, Denise Stanley, has spent the rest of her life waiting for justice that has not come. The death of a 14-year-old child triggered an outcry across Britain. The marches, the protests, and the headlines that followed were when the press first started to call Manchester by its new nickname, Gunchester. The name stuck for the next 2 decades. The numbers got worse. By the late 1990s, gunfire in South Manchester had become a daily event. In 1996, there were 28 confirmed shootings in the area, with 12 wounded and 4 dead. In 1997, that figure jumped to 68 confirmed shootings, with 39 injuries and 6 fatalities. In 1999, more bullets were fired in Greater Manchester than in any other year on record. Police recovered more than 270 spent shell casings, with most of them in the South Manchester areas of Longsight, Moss Side, and Hume. Between January 1997 and November 2000, there were 270 separate shootings. Only 8% led to anyone being convicted. In April 2004, the war reached one of its lowest points. A double shooting in Moss Side left wounded gang members on both sides. By chance, members of the Gooch and a rival outfit called the Longsight crew ended up in the same accident and emergency department at Manchester Royal Infirmary. They spotted each other. Within minutes, around 20 armed gang members were running through the hospital corridors with handguns drawn. Patients and doctors fled. The hospital went into lockdown. 10 gang members were eventually arrested, though no firearms charges could be brought because the weapons were smuggled out before police arrived. In 2009, the war finally cracked open. 11 members of the Gooch gang stood trial at Liverpool Crown Court. The trial was moved 35 miles away from Manchester to reduce the risk of witness intimidation. The 2 top figures of the Gooch were a man called Colin Joyce, known on the streets as Piggy, and a man called Lee Amos, known as Cabbo. Joyce was found guilty of 2 murders. He was sentenced to a minimum of 39 years. Amos was found guilty of one murder. He was sentenced to a minimum of 35 years, later reduced to 32 on appeal. Manchester's chief prosecutor at the time, John Holt, called the convictions a moment of enormous significance for public safety. The Gunchester era was finally coming to an end. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While South Manchester was tearing itself apart in the 1990s and 2000s, a quieter operator across the river in Salford was building a very different kind of empire. He was raising 11 children in a leafy suburb, driving expensive cars, and hiding a £300 million drug operation in plain sight. Section 7. Paul One Punch Doyle, the Salford hardman who hid in Altrincham. For 10 years, the neighbours on a quiet, leafy street in Altrincham thought the man at number whatever it was on Wainwright Road was just an ordinary family man. He was short, polite, and lived in an £800,000 detached house with his wife and 11 children. He did the school run. He paid his bills. He kept to himself. What the neighbours did not know was that the man living next door was one of the most feared hardmen in the history of Salford. They did not know that he had spent most of his adult life in prison. They did not know that the comfortable middle-class life he was living was being paid for by drugs. And they certainly did not know that he was running a wholesale operation worth £300 million out of a house in their cul-de-sac. His name was Paul Doyle. The streets of Manchester knew him by a different name. They called him One Punch. Paul Doyle was taken into care at the age of 9. He had no real education. He grew up in Salford's Catholic reform schools, the same harsh institutions that produced his future friend and rival, Paul Massey. By the time he came out, he had no qualifications, no job prospects, and no plan beyond surviving on the streets of 1970s Manchester. He was small. He stood at 5'8" tall. Rivals constantly underestimated him because of his size. They learned the hard way that they were wrong to do so. The night that gave him his nickname happened in the early 1970s at a Manchester nightclub called Pips. A fight broke out. Paul Doyle was at the centre of it. In quick succession, he knocked 5 men out cold. Each one went down from a single blow. Word spread fast around Manchester. The story passed from pub to pub. By the end of the week, every criminal in the city knew about the small Salford lad with the heavy fist. They started calling him One Punch Doyle. The name stayed with him for the next 50 years. He moved into armed robbery. He became a serious face on the Manchester United football hooligan scene, fighting alongside the Red Army at home and away matches across Britain and Europe. The detectives who tracked him over the decades knew him as a handy lad from Salford. One officer, after watching CCTV footage of Doyle knocking another man out, said it was one of the best punches he had ever seen. He served multiple prison terms. By the early 2000s, he had just come out of a 7-year sentence for drug dealing. He had no money, no job, and no obvious way to start again. So he did something nobody on his street ever expected. In 2004, he and his wife bought a house on Wainwright Road in Altrincham. The house cost £800,000. At the time, Paul Doyle had never had a legitimate job in his life and was claiming benefits. His wife filled in the mortgage paperwork, claiming she was a senior executive earning £200,000 a year. None of it was true. The mortgage was approved. The repayments came to £3,000 a month. For a few years the family managed. They moved in 11 children. Doyle stayed quiet. The neighbours assumed he was a successful businessman. Then around 2012, the money started to get tight. The mortgage was eating up everything. Doyle made a decision that would end his freedom for the next 8 years. He went back to what he knew. He started organising large wholesale drug deals. Between 2012 and 2014, Doyle was at the centre of a series of major drug shipments moving across the north of England. The cargo included heroin, cocaine, cannabis, and amphetamines. Police across multiple regions began to pick up the trail. They put surveillance teams on him. They followed his deals. They built up the case quietly. In 2014, they raided his house in Altrincham. The total value of the drug operation Doyle was running came to £300 million. In 2015, he was sentenced at Manchester Crown Court to 16 years in prison. He had just turned 57. He served part of his sentence at Thorn Cross Open Prison in Warrington. where he started writing a memoir about his life. The book was called Surviving the Madness. Prison authorities moved him to a closed Category C prison at HMP Hindley in Wigan, reportedly as punishment for breaching his licence conditions while writing about his crimes. In October 2022, Paul Doyle was released on licence after serving exactly half of his 16-year sentence. He was 64 years old. His old friend Paul Massey had been killed 7 years earlier. Doyle had not been able to attend the funeral because he was inside. When he came out, he gave interviews promising he was a changed man. He said the police had won the war on drugs in Manchester. He said the modern dealers were walking straight into prison sentences longer than the ones handed to murderers. He said his only goal now was to steer young people away from the path he had taken. Paul Doyle had spent 5 decades hiding £300 million worth of crime behind a quiet front door in Altrincham. But while he was building his empire alone, another generation of Salford gangsters were busy tearing themselves apart. The war that started after Paul Massey was killed would set off the most violent gang feud the city had seen in decades, with grenades on doorsteps and a young child caught in the crossfire. Section 8. The Salford Gang War. A-Team versus Anti-A-Team. When Paul Massey was shot dead in his own driveway in July 2015, the city of Salford did not simply mourn its most famous gangster, it exploded. Within hours of his death, the streets started filling with men carrying handguns, military grenades, and machetes. By the end of that year, there had been 19 separate shootings across the city. The war had a name on the streets. It was a war between the A-Team and the Anti-A-Team. It was the bloodiest local feud Manchester had seen in 20 years. The A-Team had been formed in 2012. They were a new generation of Salford criminals, around 50 men strong, most of them in their 20s and 30s. Their leader was a young crook called Stephen Britton. Britton had been personally mentored by Paul Massey himself. He had grown up watching the older man build his empire on the doors of the city's nightclubs. The A-Team modelled themselves on what Massey had built. They moved drugs, they ran security, they were involved in violence and extortion. They liked the spotlight. Members of the A-Team rubbed shoulders with footballers and television personalities. They posed for photographs at high-end events, all dressed in matching white shirts and white denim, like a boy band. They wore designer watches. They drove luxury cars. Behind the polished image, every member of the crew had a serious criminal record. Some of them had explosive tempers. They were earning thousands of pounds a week from cocaine alone. The trouble started over something small. Reports later suggested it began with a young woman throwing a drink at someone in a Salford nightclub. Within weeks, men who had grown up together on the same Salford streets had become sworn enemies. The A-Team split in half. On one side stood Stephen Britton and his loyalists. On the other stood a senior figure called Michael Carroll, who had broken away with a man called Jamie Rothwell. Carroll and Rothwell formed the rival faction that the streets quickly named the Anti-A-Team. Paul Massey spent the last months of his life trying to mediate between the two sides. He was the only man in Salford with the authority to do it. His protégé Stephen Britton was on one side. His new rivals were on the other. On the day he was killed, Massey had been in North Wales meeting with Britton at a holiday park called Wincups, trying to talk him down from the war. He never got home alive. The Anti-A-Team claimed responsibility for hiring the hitman who killed Paul Massey. The A-Team wanted blood. The man they wanted most of all was a Manchester businessman called Christian Hickey Sr. Hickey had been the best man at Michael Carroll's wedding. The two were close friends and had financial ties. To the A-Team, hurting Christian Hickey was the same as hurting Carroll himself. On the night of the 12th of October 2015, just under 3 months after Paul Massey had died, 2 figures arrived at the Hickey family home in Winton, Salford. Inside the house were Christian Hickey, his wife Jane, their 7-year-old son Christian Jr., and their daughter, who was returning from a swimming lesson. Jane Hickey opened the front doors around 9:30 in the evening. A man was standing there asking for her husband. Behind him, a second man stepped forward and opened fire with a Heckler & Koch self-loading pistol. Both Jane Hickey and her 7-year-old son Christian were hit in the legs. One bullet passed through Jane's leg and into the leg of her son, who was standing behind her. They both collapsed in the hallway of their home. Both survived. They were left with serious injuries. The boy was 7 years old. Greater Manchester Police's Protected Persons Unit later relocated the entire family. A court order was put in place to prevent further identification. The shooting of a child on his own doorstep shocked the country. Detectives launched a major investigation that would take years to unravel. The man who knocked on the door that night, used to flush Christian Hickey Sr. out into the open, was a drug dealer called Carney Thomason, who was earning around £5,000 a week. He was later convicted, along with several others. The war continued for years. Grenades were thrown at family homes across Salford. Rivals were kidnapped. In March 2017, Jamie Rothwell himself was shot in the abdomen and arm at a car wash near Wigan. He survived. The same gun used in the Hickey shooting was used in that attack as well. Multiple convictions followed. Former Manchester detective Chris Sutton later went on record describing the war between the A-Team and the anti-A-Team. He said it was worse than anything seen in the 1990s, when the city had been called Gunchester. The number of shootings, the use of military-grade weapons, and the willingness to target homes and families had all reached a new level. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Salford was tearing itself apart in the 2000s, a much older venue at the heart of Manchester's culture had already shown how organised crime and the city's club scene could grow into each other. Long before Stephen Britton or Michael Carroll, the Haçienda was the place where every gang in Manchester wanted control of the door, and where the world's most famous nightclub became a battleground. Section 9. The Haçienda. How one nightclub became a drug war battleground. The Haçienda was supposed to be the most famous nightclub in Europe. For a few years, it was. Bands like New Order, the Stone Roses, the Happy Mondays, and Madonna all played on its stage. The world's biggest DJs queued up to play its decks. People flew in from across Britain, Europe, and the United States just to spend one night on its dance floor. But by the time it shut its doors for the last time in June 1997, the Haçienda had become something else entirely. It had become the centre of a gangland war that was tearing Manchester apart. The club was built inside a former yacht builder's warehouse on the corner of Whitworth Street West and Albion Street, right on the edge of the city centre. It was opened in May 1982 by the record label Factory Records, the band New Order, and a Manchester television presenter called Tony Wilson. The building cost £344,000 to convert. New Order put in £100,000 of their own money to keep it going. For its first few years, the Haçienda lost money every single week. Then in 1986, it became one of the first British clubs to start playing American house music. By the summer of 1987, it had gone from making a constant loss to selling out every night. The acid house scene exploded. The press called it Madchester. The Haçienda was at the centre of all of it. But there was a problem nobody had planned for. With house music came a new drug called ecstasy. Clubbers stopped buying alcohol at the bar. They drank water all night and danced for hours instead. The bar takings collapsed. At the same time, the demand for ecstasy meant huge amounts of money were changing hands inside the club every weekend. Whoever controlled the door of the Haçienda controlled who got to sell drugs inside it. Every gang in Manchester wanted that door. On the 14th of July 1989, a 16-year-old girl called Claire Layton collapsed and died at the club after taking ecstasy. It was the first ecstasy-related death ever recorded in Britain. The story made national headlines. The Greater Manchester Police started a campaign to have the club shut down. By 1990, the doors of the Haçienda had become a battlefield. The Nunan family had moved their men into the security of the club. Damien Nunan became the head doorman. The Cheetham Hill gang under Anthony White, Tony Johnson, tried to push their way in. Johnson started threatening doormen at gunpoint. He once grabbed a microphone in the middle of the club and shouted that he was the top dog. Tony Wilson and the rest of the Factory Records owners watched their dream venue slip out of their control. In January 1991, things got so bad that Tony Wilson held a press conference on the Haçienda dance floor. Standing in front of the cameras, looking exhausted and pale, he announced that the club was voluntarily closing its doors because of the threat of gang violence. He said the owners were sick and tired of dealing with personal violence and could no longer guarantee the safety of their staff and customers. The closure lasted only a few months. The club reopened later in 1991, with a national security firm brought in to run the doors. The new firm tried to clean things up. The new doormen were threatened with guns, and with worse. The drug dealers walked back in, the shootings continued. By 1997, the situation was beyond repair. In a single year, Greater Manchester Police recorded 68 confirmed shootings across the city, with 6 of them ending in deaths. When magistrates and police officers visited the Haçienda that year as part of a licence review, they actually witnessed an attack right outside the club. An 18-year-old man called Andrew Delahunty was hit over the head from behind with a metal bar and pushed in front of an oncoming car. The club lost its entertainment's licence in June 1997. The very last night of the Haçienda was held on the 28th of June 1997. The club night was called Freak. The final live act on the stage had been a band called Spiritualized 2 weeks earlier, on the 15th of June. The doors were locked. Peter Hook of New Order later worked out that the club had lost up to £18 million in its later years. He said that every single person who had ever walked through the door of the Haçienda had cost the owners around £10 because of mismanagement and theft. The empty building stood there for years. In 2002, it was purchased by an Australian property developer called Crosby Homes. They knocked the entire structure down. In its place, they built a luxury apartment block. The new flats were called the Haçienda Apartments. People still live there today. Most of them have no idea that the floor under their feet was once the stage where Madonna made her UK debut, where the Stone Roses played their early gigs, and where the Manchester gangs once fought a war that helped destroy the most famous nightclub Britain ever produced. Tony Wilson died of cancer in August 2007. He was 57 years old. The Haçienda outlived him in legend, if not in stone. The era of the old Manchester gangs ended with the closure of the Haçienda, but the city's drug trade only got bigger. By the 2020s, a new generation of dealers had emerged, with encrypted phones, international supply lines, and operations worth tens of millions of pounds. They thought their technology made them invisible. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. Section 10. The EncroChat era. Modern Manchester drug lords felled by their own phones. In March 2020, every serious drug dealer in Manchester thought he had finally won. They were carrying a special kind of phone called an EncroChat. The phones cost around €1,000 each and were sold on a subscription. They had no camera, no microphone, and no GPS. The hardware itself had been physically removed. 2 operating systems ran side by side. To anyone who picked it up, the phone looked like a normal Android device. But if the user pressed a particular combination, it switched to a completely separate encrypted system, where every message was scrambled, every contact was a code name, and every transaction was hidden from law enforcement. The dealers used these phones to order drug shipments, arrange handovers, plan robberies, and discuss who needed to be hurt. They sent each other photographs of cocaine bricks, stacks of cash, and high-powered firearms. They believed nothing they typed could ever be read by the police. Then in early 2020, French law enforcement quietly hacked the entire EncroChat network. Between March and June of that year, French police, working alongside Dutch police and Europol, intercepted more than 115 million messages from around 60,000 EncroChat users across Europe. They passed everything to the British authorities, who launched an investigation called Operation Venetic. The National Crime Agency in the United Kingdom started reading the conversations of around 10,000 suspected criminals in real time. The dealers had no idea they were being watched. When EncroChat realised what was happening, the company sent out a panic message to every user, telling them to throw their phones away. By then it was too late. On the 13th of June 2020, the entire network shut down. The arrests in the United Kingdom started immediately. By October 2023, Operation Venetic had led to more than 3,100 arrests across Britain. There had been 1,240 convictions. The total combined prison sentences came to nearly 8,000 years. Police seized 173 firearms, 3,459 rounds of ammunition, and more than 9 tons of Class A drugs. Greater Manchester Police were at the centre of the entire operation. The names that came out of the Manchester arrests read like a modern version of the old gangster era. Jamie Rothwell, born and raised in Salford, was identified as the head of a multi-million-pound drug and gun network. He had fled to Spain when the EncroChat hack broke and was directing the importation of drugs, firearms and cash from abroad. He was arrested in Barcelona on the 24th of May 2020. In August 2025, Rothwell was sentenced at Manchester Crown Court to 43 years in prison. The combined sentences for him and his 9 associates came to around 207 years. Then there was Jonathan Cassidy, originally from Liverpool but operating across the northwest. He had fled to Dubai when the arrests began and was picked up at Manchester Airport when he returned in October 2020. Cassidy and a Bury man called Nasser Ahmed had been importing close to £26 million worth of cocaine into the UK. Cassidy had compared himself to the Mexican drug lord El Chapo while watching the Netflix series Narcos with friends, joking that they shared the same birthday. He had also sent a photograph of a box of Panadol painkillers to a friend. The image was so sharp that fingerprint experts later lifted his print directly from the picture and used it to confirm his identity. He was sentenced in March 2024 to 21 years and 9 months. Ahmed received the same sentence. Another major figure was Gregory Bell of Prestbury in Cheshire. He ran his operation like a corporate business. He had spoofed identities. He had a network of couriers who submitted timesheets to claim wages for drug deliveries. He owned 32 houses while declaring no income for 6 years. When officers raided his Alderley Edge apartment, they found £77,000 worth of designer clothing in his wardrobe. In a safe house in Bury, they recovered 4 kilos of cocaine, half a kilo of heroin, £35,000 in cash, and a money counting machine. In another property, they found £150,000 in cash. Bell was sentenced to 18 years and 9 months in October 2025. The EncroChat hack changed organised crime in Britain forever. The drug dealers had built their entire empires around the belief that their phones were uncrackable. When that belief turned out to be false, an entire generation of Manchester gangsters watched their futures vanish in a single courtroom verdict after another. Many of them are still being arrested and sentenced today. The investigation has not stopped. The story of Manchester's most notorious gangsters and drug lords is the story of a city that has spent the last 50 years trying to escape its own shadow. From Anthony White. Tony Johnson lying in a pub car park in 1991 to Paul Massey shot in his own driveway in 2015. From the Haçienda losing its battle for the door to the boy who was hit in his own hallway. From the streets of Moss Side during the Gunchester years to the Salford gangsters whose own phones gave them away. Every name in this list has left a mark on the place. Manchester is one of the greatest cities in the world. It is also a city where the line between business and bloodshed has often been thinner than the people walking past it ever realised. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.